Welcome to the American Museum of Tort Law. My name is Melissa Bird, and I am the director of the museum. The American Museum of Tort Law is located in Winsted, Connecticut, and is dedicated to educating the public about tort law and the benefits of trial by jury. The museum features exhibits, artifacts, and interactive displays that explore landmark tort cases and their impact on safety, justice, and corporate accountability in the United States. It is a thought-provoking resource for those interested in the legal system and its influence on consumer protection and public welfare. We are proud to sponsor this discussion on food safety during the Trump administration with guest speakers Bill Marler and Sarah Sorscher. Bill Marler is an accomplished attorney and national expert in food safety. He is the most prominent foodborne illness lawyer in America and a major force in food policy in the US and around the world. Over the last 30 years, he has represented thousands of individuals in claims against food companies whose contaminated products have caused life-altering injury and death. And Sarah Sorscher. Sarah is the Director of Regulatory Affairs at the Center for Science in the Public Interest. She's an experienced advocate for public health who fights for a safer, healthier, more transparent food system by promoting consumer safeguards in Congress, federal agencies, and state and local governments. As Director of Regulatory Affairs, she manages CSPI's policy work related to food safety and labeling, allergens, food additives, and dietary supplements, and other consumer products. Today, we are turning our attention to a timely topic that affects all Americans. We will be speaking about the Trump administration's sweeping deregulatory agenda, including, but not limited to, the efforts to roll back critical protections enforced by the FDA and the USDA, and how that affects ordinary Americans. So let's begin. But before I introduce our distinguished guests, we have a short video clip.
In 1993, it was Jack in the Box hamburgers. 4 people died.
Health officials expect to see more young victims.
In 1998, it was hot dogs. 14 people died. In 2006, it was bagged spinach.
E. coli linked to tainted spinach.
2008, peanuts. 2018, romaine lettuce. Last year, boar's head.
Boar's Head is recalling 9 types of deli meats.
Every year, some of the food that's supposed to keep us healthy winds up killing people. What's going on?
I mean, I hate to just keep saying it's complicated, but it's complicated. You know, what causes problems and what needs to be done to fix them.
Mike Taylor has spent his entire career trying to make food safer.
I've led the food safety programs at both FDA and USDA.
Can you give us some context for these foodborne illness outbreaks?
Well, it's this familiar litany of 3,000 deaths annually and 48 million illnesses. But it's just hard to measure and quantify.
15 federal agencies plus state agencies oversee our food system. The USDA regulates meat, poultry, eggs, and, weirdly, catfish. The FDA covers about everything else. In 2011, Mike Taylor helped pass the Food Safety Modernization Act, which tries to prevent outbreaks before they happen.
Congress and the administration simply haven't funded the implementation fully, but it was clearly a big step forward.
The bacteria that make us sick mostly come from beef, poultry, and produce.
It used to be, Jack in the Box, that beef was something we worried about.
When that happened, we made a decision to simply declare that no longer would that particular kind of E. coli be lawful in ground beef. And that had a big effect because the meat industry collaborated among themselves, came up with technologies to really minimize that risk.
But when the USDA proposed a similar regulation for chicken, industry lobbyists said it would be too expensive.
The trade associations, the lobby showed up and essentially stonewalled the USDA going forward with this.
According to the USDA, 7% of all raw chicken parts and 27% of all ground chicken are contaminated with salmonella, and there's no law against shipping it that way. But now we come to the big one, produce. Almost half of all foodborne illnesses come from fruits and vegetables because, after all, we don't cook most of it before eating. The 2006 spinach outbreak was a wake-up call for the farming industry.
September of 2006, FDA said, do not eat spinach, right? And that literally affected every grower, provider of spinach in the country. So California said, we need to do something from a food safety standpoint.
And that's how the Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement was born, a coalition of farmers overseen by the California Department of Food and Agriculture who've agreed to adopt food safety protocols sooner and more stringent than the government's. 94% of the nation's leafy greens are covered by this agreement. Tim York is the CEO.
It sounds like these farmers are, in essence, saying, hey, let's impose rules on ourselves.
That's exactly right. Yes, which is kind of anathema to how they normally think, right?
Yeah.
We have to do it. You know, any kind of outbreak is detrimental to our industry.
Jack Vesey is a fourth-generation produce farmer. On the day we visited his 10,000-acre farm in Southern California, his team harvested nearly 500,000 cabbages.
I take this produce to my family every night. I give it to my friends.
So you can walk over here and just eat that without washing?
I do.
Can I?
Well, you don't have a hairnet. No.
Oh, man.
Just a little baby fresh one here. Take that
Thank
right
you,
there.
man. Tastes like safety. If I was a farmer 25 years ago and teleported here.
Well, if my dad was here today, he'd probably think, oh my gosh, what are you guys doing now? You know, the tissue sampling, the water testing, the treating of the water.
The LGMA rules require sanitizing the irrigation water, testing it at the source and at the spraying end, hairnets and gloves, knife disinfectant.
For traceability's purposes, you guys...
And at least 6 times a year, inspections from state auditors like Nancy Howdigi.
We're checking for any kind of environmental risks. In addition to that, there's an interview portion where I'm interviewing several crew members.
Vesey's farm even holds mock food outbreak drills twice a year.
Our food safety manager will call our office and say, recall this field, this block. I need answers. And I can tell you who was in there, what fertilizer company, what seed company, what crew was in there, everything within 30 minutes. Because stopping a truck or bringing that product back and recalling as quick as possible is very important.
All right, so despite all of this, outbreaks still happen. So why are they still happening?
Outbreaks may occur because we are growing product outdoors. You know, some bacteria just occur naturally within an environment. They just exist. And so we control as much of the ecosystem as we can.
Of course, you can't control every variable outdoors.
Before they walk into this field to start harvesting this cabbage, what they'll do is walk around the field and look. If there's bird dropping, they would remove this entire block from production or harvest, because that's a potential risk.
And so, as 2025 dawned, that's where things stood. Beef contamination largely under control, chicken still no law against salmonella, produce farmers controlling the parts of the process they can control. And then this happened.
Tonight, federal cuts are prompting a warning about food safety.
Everywhere you look, the ability of the agency to do this fundamental job will be impaired.
The Trump administration has fired 3,500 people from the FDA, saying that it's eliminating waste. Hundreds of them worked in the Food Safety Division, whose director resigned in protest.
Bad stuff will happen, whether it's the inability to promptly investigate an outbreak, the inability to oversee imports in a way that keeps foreign products that are making people sick.
There are people who say, oh my God, you people, what can I eat that's safe anymore?
I mean, you know, it's 3,000 deaths. Every one is a huge tragedy for a family and for the victim. You know, but think of how many eating occasions there are in a day. People are eating all the time, all year round. All those eating occasions, it's extremely low risk that you're going to get sick. And you got to eat.
Welcome, Bill. Thank you for joining us at the museum again. We really appreciate your sharing your knowledge with our patrons and your time. Our patrons come to the museum for current and relevant information on topics that affect them. So I would love it if you would start by sharing your take on the current food policy, and a question I just have on, as an aside, whether you think that there are state regulations and tort law, whether they'll be able to help fill in some of the gaps, I guess is what I'm trying to say with this agenda.
Yeah, that's a great question. First, thanks for having me on. It's always great to share the stage with Sarah. I've been to the museum. It's great. It's a great resource. It's great that Ralph put that together. Obviously, as a trial lawyer, I've seen the benefits of the ability for consumers to stand up to large corporations and take them to a jury and have that jury of their peers make those decisions about both liability and damages. So I commend Ralph and I commend the work that you guys do. I think there's a lot going on in these first 4 months, 5 months of the Trump administration that really raises a lot of concerns. Sarah, frankly, has boots on the ground and always has been. CSPI, has always been at the forefront of, really the good work that's done day to day to protect consumers. And I know that she can speak in much more detail about what the Trump administration is doing. But, from a trial lawyer's point of view, and representing consumers, we're already starting to see the impacts of this new sort of regulatory scheme. You can, for a moment, the whole idea of MAHA, Make America Healthy Again, the concepts behind it, but what we've really seen over the last 5 months has been more performance art than anything substantive. And when you let 20,000 employees go from HHS, and you see the impact both at CDC and FDA, in the Justice Department. Sarah was, quoted the other day talking about the changes in the Justice Department. All of that is impacting, our ability to, and changing our way of approaching these cases. We could always see the FDA, CDC, FSIS, and the Justice Department as working kind of collaboratively with us and the victims to get justice. Right now, there's no one home at CDC, FDA, FSIS, and the Justice Department to have that partnership anymore. So to get to your question, how's this going to impact us? I actually think we're going to have to see state health departments, state departments, the attorney generals. I think they're going to have to step up. It's going to be kind of a coalition of the willing to, put food safety first, because, these first 5 months of the Trump administration are sending a pretty strong message that, food safety is not a priority, a real priority. It might be a good talking point and a good press conference, but it's not, in my view, has been real.
Sarah, I just wanted, do you have anything just to add to that?
No, I think Bill is so right. And it truly is a synergistic relationship that we have between state tort liability, state regulations and requirements, federal requirements. Also, the detective work that happens at the federal level is so important. And Bill is right. We have the hardest thing about this moment is that we really do need champions for food safety at the federal level. Someone to stand up to food companies, to address dangerous food additives, to create standards for contamination, to increase access to nutritious food. And these are the things that are actually being promised on the surface by the Trump administration, because they know that there's bipartisan support for food safety, right? That if people want a safer and healthier food system. And the difficulty in this moment is that it's like Americans have been asking for a Superman to save our food system, And what we've gotten is something more like Bizarro Superman, right? He has a costume with an S on it, but he's like a corrupted clone of the hero that we need. And when he says he's doing good, what's actually happening is so twisted and backwards that it achieves the opposite of what he's promised. And so, I think that's the challenge right now. And states and state tort liability are going to be the sort of last holdouts that are preventing the collapse of the system, because they serve as a backstop and an extra check on some of these food safety practices.
So now,
let me just jump in. A couple of great examples too, that I think, underscore the problems that we're seeing now. Sarah and others worked so hard for years to get some movement on standards for salmonella in chicken. And, we could disagree, how far the last administration went, but it was like a lot of things in government. It's, you got to take the steps. You got to take the things, the wins where you can, and then build on those. And sometimes that's hard. It's hard for somebody like me sometimes, that I want the whole meal done at the same time. But, the work that Sarah did and what the CSPI did has completely been rolled back, by the Trump administration. We essentially, the standards with respect to salmonella in chicken are being thrown out the window. And then just recently, through, tort law, I uncovered a 89-person E. coli outbreak that the FDA and CDC investigated. It was 15 states, half the people hospitalized, 7 children with acute kidney failure requiring dialysis, and a death. And it was completely not reported. It was only through, the work that I do that we figured out that there was an outbreak. And fortunately, it's starting to get a little bit of traction that, hopefully people ask tough questions of people in power and go, why aren't you telling the public about this? And I think that's, those are just two of many examples I'm sure Sarah could give as well, of things that are happening that really do have an impact on consumers.
Where should people be going to find out accurate information? Now you can't even go on like the CDC website, or you can't find things in the same way. Where does an ordinary person go for their information?
CSPI. For what?
Yeah,
thanks. No, but I mean, I think we're living in a really difficult time. I'm not going to tell you that everybody could go to Food Safety News to get their information about food safety, but at least, we're trying,
No, that's right.
but the functional reality of the news business now is that we don't have, because of the economics of the news cycle, the news business, we don't have that robust, people on the ground doing investigative reporting. What's happening is, people are chasing clicks, and it makes it really difficult for consumers to get good, accurate information in a timely way. And I don't have a solution to that, but my little solution is, I urge consumers to go to CSPI and, peruse Food Safety News. It's been around for almost 16 years now. So.
Yeah, so we do have some consumer-facing resources, including our newsletter, Nutrition Action, which provides both a layperson's summary of the latest nutrition evidence and research, and also food safety evidence and research. And I would say 2 things to this question of where should consumers get their information beyond signing up for Nutrition Action. That is, number 1, I don't think you should change your eating habits because of President Trump, right? I think because of that tort liability, because of the state system, we still have checks and balances in place. And I don't think industry is going out there and rubbing E. coli all over the lettuce because so I think by and large we're sort of coasting on the culture that we've built because of the standards that we've created, and we haven't seen too many regulatory rollbacks. We've seen enforcement plummet, right? But the regulations and standards are still there. So if a company violates those standards, they have to face people like Bill, right? And so your eating habits should be, you should be cooking your meat thoroughly. You should be keeping your raw meat separated from your produce. You should be following that guidance around the temperature, using an instant thermometer, not leaving food out for too long. Those are the general things that consumers need to know to stay safe. But the second thing I would say is to keep the pressure on companies, we need those experts at the federal level, at CDC and FDA and USDA, solving outbreaks. So that outbreak that Bill publicized, we didn't hear about it because they fired their communications staff, but their outbreak investigators are still on the job. So Bill was able to figure it out, right? So we need to, there's still time to, that means there's still time to act. And so we need people writing their members of Congress and screaming bloody murder that they need to stop the dismantling and reverse the dismantling of our public health agencies. And that's why you should visit CSPI's website, because we have action alerts up for you to write in your member of Congress and block these cuts. Because if those people leave their jobs, that creates ripple effects, and we're losing the pressure on the companies, which will lead to a loss of that food safety culture.
Okay, so now I have a question. Do you expect to see a rise in unsafe food handling or contamination outbreaks? Are you already seeing those in this short amount of time? I mean, obviously, it's something that was already happening. I don't want to act like there wasn't something already here.
I will tell you the most terrifying future that we could have is a future with no outbreak notices.
Yeah.
Right? That's what I'm worried about, is that and come the fall, if we do not see a flood of outbreaks being solved, that's because they've cut the outbreak investigation teams. Because every fall, it gets warm in the summer, that's when the bacteria grow. We have really terrific technology now to sequence DNA so that we can connect unrelated cases, and use AI to look at what they've eaten to solve outbreaks like we've never been able to do in the past. We saw a dip in outbreaks during COVID because all of the people who were solving those were being reassigned to COVID work. But now that they're back at their desks, we should see more outbreaks. And that's a good thing because, again, when we identify the cause of those outbreaks, that's how companies are able to prevent them. So that's what I'm worried about, is actually a decline in outbreak notices based on these changes.
Now, do you think you'll see a growth in distrust kind of in, I mean, certainly one portion, but do you think people will begin to distrust government and maybe the food industry's just ability to actually have oversight of some kind that you can depend on?
Well, the reality is the people who distrust government are now in charge of government, which makes it incredibly problematic. And, to sort of build on what Sarah said, my fear about, these outbreak investigations, because I completely agree with Sarah, the whole point of these investigations are get the product off the market if the product is still on the market, get a recall. Recalls are good, or getting to the root cause of how the outbreak happened, because that's how, unfortunately, that's how humans learn. We usually learn from making mistakes, sometimes, unfortunately, repeated times. My real worry about lack of having people do the investigations or report on the investigations, it's sort of like, if a tree falls in the woods and no one is around to hear it, maybe you can just say the forest is completely intact. And I worry that when we don't do investigations, when we don't report, all of a sudden we can say, hey, look, we're doing a great job. There's been no more outbreaks. Now, the reality is, and I think this, again, backs up what Sarah says, is the system is there. Fortunately nowadays, when you have an E. coli outbreak or a salmonella outbreak, right now, those are reportable diseases by law. And to sort of give you a little bit of understanding about how important that is, most people think the Jack in the Box E. coli outbreak that was sort of the start of my career in 1993. It started in 1993. It actually started in November, December of 92, but the state where that outbreak first began, E. coli was not a reportable disease. So nobody knew that there was an outbreak going on. So the meat got shipped around Western United States and the outbreak blew up. Today, E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria are reportable diseases by health departments on a state level. So we should have that system in place that counts, unfortunately, the bodies, that they'll count these illnesses. And Sarah's right, with whole genome sequencing, if we have a case in Connecticut and Washington, D.C., and this other Washington where I am, and we're all the same genetic fingerprint, we know there's an outbreak going on just with 3 people. And then it's just a matter of, do we have the bodies, the people to do the hard work to figure out what the cause is and get the product off the market? The system exists. My worry is we're not going to have the people, the federal partners to do it. And again, I think it's going to have to be departments of health in states that see this as an important thing. They're going to have to step up. It's going to be AGs, it's going to be governors. That's where I think a lot of the heavy lifting on food safety is going to be. And fortunately, we're going to have, consumer advocates like Sarah in DC, doing what they can to keep their finger in the dike so the whole thing doesn't explode.
Yeah, and I will jump in and say there is one team that has been let go that's very important to this work. In 2022, there was a nationwide outbreak of lead poisoning in children, elevated blood lead levels, and the CDC's environmental health team worked with FDA and state and local departments to trace that outbreak to a surprising source. This is an atypical cinnamon applesauce pouches sold across the United States. And it's atypical because there was a foreign supplier who had added lead chromate to the cinnamon, which is an economic, profit-motivated move to add color and weight. And the lead in that cinnamon was so high that kids were being poisoned from just a small amount of cinnamon in the applesauce pouches. And this incident it's so rare that it takes a really brilliant team to identify the source. And because they were able to do that, FDA pulled the pouches and it put FDA and industry on red alert to avoid future incidents. So it's creating that prevention. RFK Jr., you'd think this would be a key priority for him, stopping foreign suppliers from poisoning our kids with lead. But what he actually did was on April 1st, he and the DOJ teams at HHS eliminated the entire division that prevents lead poisoning in kids, including that team. So it's like the worst April Fool's Day joke on the American people you could possibly imagine. And we are currently fighting to get that division restored. We had members of Congress grilling RFK Jr. during his testimony last week, and we're going to keep pushing. And so that's why it's so important for voices to be heard. That team also handles restaurant outbreaks and cruise ship inspections. So it does impact food safety and pathogen safety. So this will be sort of a test case of whether we can hold them accountable for these firings, because they could do the same thing to the other teams that investigate foodborne outbreaks, and then we would be in a real bad situation.
Yeah, scary. So when did the cinnamon applesauce happen? Was that just recently?
That was 2022, 2023.
Okay. So now I know that vaccinations aren't really the food safety, but I have noticed that that also is being something that's talked about now. And I guess with our standards changing from the European Unions, I just wondered if you had any comments on that. Or again, if there was, is it something that you should just be looking outside of the United States for recommendations and advice?
I've been a big advocate of hepatitis A vaccines for food service workers. I have been involved in multiple hepatitis A outbreaks caused by an ill worker unknowingly transmitting hepatitis because they're most infectious before they know they're actually sick, transmitting that potentially deadly virus to people in restaurant settings, and have been involved in cases where people have lost their livers and had to have transplants, or unfortunately have passed because of that. So, the difficulty is, with people being concerned about vaccines, and frankly, this government and many of the MAHA movement, being anti-vaxxers, trying to convince people to get vaccines to not only protect themselves, but to protect others is a hard sell. But, vaccines, can be certainly a food safety issue and have been.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah, and I will say, this was this was an example of how the industry, the administration is failing on transparency because we have so little information about why they made this decision. What we have at this point is like a 50-second clip that was posted on X, right, saying that they no longer recommended these vaccinations. So, this is the opposite of radical transparency. Obviously, we need more information about what the science basis for this decision was. But the bottom line is it's not just a recommendation, because insurance companies will often rely on CDC's advice to decide what they're covering or not. So this is also about not just about freedom of choice, but about access to vaccines. And that's the scariest part of this, is that people who want to get vaccinated might not be able to because of this decision that has no scientific backing so far.
Now, what would you say are the most urgent areas that food and drug safety protections would need to either be restored or strengthened today?
So I think Bill mentioned the first thing that they could do to strengthen protections would be to move forward with the Salmonella rulemaking on poultry. Salmonella is the disease most likely to put you in the hospital for food poisoning, and chicken is the leading source of Salmonella food poisoning. So being able to regulate those products is just would be a key advance. And what we saw under Biden was, they created a standard for a narrow category of products, which is actually still on the books. They haven't been enforcing it, but it's still on the books. And it was for raw stuffed breaded products like chicken cordon bleu. They're particularly high risk because of the levels of contamination, how hard it is to cook them through. But they were going to move forward with standards that would require testing and elimination of the worst types of contamination in all poultry products. And those are the ones that were pulled. So that's probably the biggest thing they could do to address food safety. I think the other thing is to adequately fund inspection. We had the Food Safety Modernization Act, which was passed in 2010. That act has been implemented through state inspections under contracts with the federal government. That system has been struggling for years due to underfunding, and Biden was making efforts to reorganize to ensure that it was working better, but still they were being starved of funding by Congress. And so at this point, that system is at a crisis. We saw cuts implemented this spring of about 30% across the United States for those programs, which is substantial. And we're likely to see food safety inspections plummeting as a result, when what we really need to be seeing is an increase in funding for those programs.
Yeah, and my big one of my big issues is one that also Sarah has championed is a lot of times when these outbreaks happen and it's unclear, at the end they go, well, it happened in Yuma or it happened in Salinas, it's linked to romaine lettuce. I mean, we're not really quite sure exactly how it happened or why. That's because the investigators are not allowed to go on to nearby farms where the cows are. So there's always this little question that, logically, I think people who understand O157 E. coli transmission know where these things come from. They come from cows. But to have that sort of clear evidence makes it easy to sort of kick the can down the road and not do the sort of hard regulatory work and land use work that needs to be done. I think that's something that really needs rectifying. The other part that's really concerning to me is the dismantling at the Justice Department of those individuals who were tasked to potentially prosecute bad actors in the food industry. It doesn't happen very often, and I can count really on one hand, maybe another finger or two, how many times there have actually been criminal prosecutions of food manufacturers, either for felony knowingly shipping contaminated product, or a misdemeanor investigation and prosecution. They're very rare. But I can tell you, as somebody who's litigated for 32 years and spoken to industry leaders for 32 years, those criminal investigations, those criminal sanctions and risks are clearly C-suite people are paying attention to those. And now those people are gone. And my fear is that, in fact, there was a presidential edict the week I was in Washington, D.C., with Sarah. There was a presidential edict saying no longer we're going to prosecute these regulatory crimes. And that just sends, the wrong message. I think we need to hold people accountable so they're paying attention to those details and they're not putting profits before safety.
Yeah, and is that just the bottom line there, that it is literally profits over safety at this point?
Well, I think Sarah's right. I think, maybe maybe it's a little bit about me being a Boy Scout. I always try to think of, the best of humans. And I think for the vast majority of processors, they're trying to do the right thing. But, there are a lot of pressures on them. It's a complex system where, there are food safety things that they should implement, but, is it too costly? Is it going to get to the bottom line? Am I going to get the board to agree to it? But those are things that will constantly, be on tap. But that's why investigations are important. That's why prosecutions in those rare cases are important. They're all to make sure that, we know. I mean, I'm a lawyer. We have all kinds of rules, trust accounts and ethics rules. The vast majority of lawyers abide by those things without thinking about them. But that's nice to have them out there just to make sure everyone's held accountable. And I think if we're going to hold trial lawyers accountable, we need to hold C-suite accountable in food safety situations.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Bill's right. These are human beings making the decisions, so they want to do right by their customers and their communities, but they're constantly being faced with a set of decisions that involve trade-offs. And there's this great example from the Jack in the Box litigation that Bill, was the lead in championing in the 1990s, where they were deciding how long to cook the burgers for, and they had guidance from the public health department saying that they needed to cook them for how many seconds was it, Bill?
Yeah, 2 minutes. Well, the 2-minute cook time, they wanted to get those things out. But eventually, as Sarah said, the difference between it's time and temperature to get internal temperature. And they did not want to move from 2 minutes to 2 minutes and 10 seconds. So a 10-second change would have saved several hundred people from getting sick. It would have saved 4 kids from dying. It would have saved nearly 100 people from acute kidney failure. So regulations mean something, and you got to make sure that people are paying attention to them.
And what makes them pay attention is it's not just they're evaluating another economic decision, right? Well, is it going to make the line move slower? Is it going to make the burgers less flavorful? Those are economic decisions. If their own hide is on the line because they could go to jail, then they prioritize food safety, right? It's not just another cost of doing business, those sick kids. It's their own life and livelihood on the line. And so they make the right call because they know that that's a risk.
Now, are there any changes going on with labeling and pasteurization standards? I did read something briefly kind of about just the dairy and how milk and dairy products are being labeled now. So I just wondered if there was any updates on that.
We haven't heard much talk of raw milk. FDA has a regulation that prevents interstate sale of raw milk. So a lot of states are legalizing raw milk. They're legalizing it for retail sales, which means it just goes and sits on the shelf with no warning, and you grab it and you take it home. You don't realize you're drinking a high-risk product. So removing that interstate prohibition would allow us to drink unpasteurized milk from other states. And we expected that to come into the crosshairs. I think they've been preoccupied with other issues, to be honest. But the Trump administration is promising a massive deregulatory push. And so we could see this falling in with a bunch of other illegal deregulatory orders at some point in the near future.
Now, Bill, are you and your people like the only one that are now tracking these increases of the foodborne illnesses if we don't have like one federal umbrella? Is it?
Yeah, it's a sad commentary, in my view, that you have a trial lawyer in Seattle, publicizing outbreaks. That's just not the way it should work. It's just because it's pretty random if you think about it. I have to be called by somebody. I have to be retained by some family, and I have to go through the process. That's a very, it's work I love. It's work that, I've dedicated my career to, but it's not the most efficient way of making this work for people and to make it safer and to make our government, be a help as opposed to a hindrance. And so, my hope is that this doesn't continue for me, but we're prepared to do it. I mean, we're upping our staff. I have an epidemiologist on staff. We brought in another person because there's a lot more, we can figure these things out. We don't, I think we don't necessarily need the FDA and CDC to do their job for us to do our job. But from a public health point of view, it's really inefficient to have me doing the work. It really needs to be, the regulators, the public health people doing their job, because not all people are going to find, me in Seattle. I mean, the 89 people who are sickened in this recent romaine lettuce E. coli outbreak, 20 people of the 89 have contacted me. The other 69 people, have no idea probably what made their kid sick or what made a person die. And so, that's a problem in my view.
And then, yeah, I would say it's really important for litigators like Bill to be involved. And we do have some resources. There's a national database where all of this genomic sequencing gets reported, and that's available for public viewing. The other entities I think who are important in all this are the state health departments, because they investigate outbreak clusters in their own state and they can tie those to national cases. And so they're still going to be out there. And there are some states that are really good at this work, like Minnesota. Shout out to Minnesota. And for solving the Coronabacter outbreak in infant formula. So we still have some ability for investigations to occur, but I think losing CDC would be a huge blow. And thankfully, as I said, those the folks at CDC who solved the pathogen outbreaks are still at their desks.
Okay. Now, a question is that does it then become very socioeconomic with states that maybe don't have as much, the financial, the resources to do something about this, or to put in those areas, or the inclination maybe, depending on which state it is?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. One is, I completely agree with Sarah about Minnesota, but Minnesota's public health budget was just cut $250 million. The federal government, yanked a grant. That's happening across states. And so, the real question is, are states going to step up and fill that gap? And it's going to be one of those things where, are they going to spend money figuring out outbreaks that impact their population, but also are they going to step up, figure out outbreaks that are going to impact people from other states? And are other states, going to, join forces to sort of create, a mini CDC based on the states that are willing? But you're absolutely correct that there are some states that frankly have no interest in food safety. There were some studies that used to come out quite frequently that would show where most foodborne illness outbreaks occurred in the United States. And it was, shocking that most of the foodborne illness outbreaks occurred in Minnesota and Washington and Oregon. And none occurred in Louisiana and Florida. And you were kind of like, wow, people are that much safer in Louisiana and Florida? Well, it's just because they weren't reporting their outbreaks. They weren't reporting their illnesses. So it skewed things like, oh, it really is unsafe to eat in Minnesota. Well, that wasn't the case. And that's going to be really the issue, I think, going forward. And again, if you think about that, because of the interdependency of food in the US and frankly from around the world, a product that gets to Minnesota or a product that gets to Florida is going to be the same product. We're seeing that now with a mini outbreak of cucumbers that's impacted 16 states. And, another salmonella outbreak, once again linked to cucumbers. And, that's important for each state to do their own investigations.
Yeah, CSPI actually put out reports all over the map, a review of state outbreak reporting, and you can still check that out. But it is hard because, like I said, it's actually the absence of outbreak reports that is scarier than the outbreak reporting itself.
So now does this send us back to maybe sourcing your food locally versus, the bigger picture? Should you be trying, if you, have the ability to, buying and sourcing your food from local sources?
I'm not sure if Bill has an opinion on local food purchasing. I think local food purchasing is wonderful for many, many reasons, environmental, social. There's not a lot of data on local foods being less subject to pathogenic contamination. Actually, from the USDA data, those smaller slaughterhouses tend to have more contamination with salmonella than larger ones. And I think there is a bias towards, these big multi-state outbreaks are more likely to get solved because when you see unrelated cases in multiple states, those are going to pop up more. There's more opportunities to catch them if that food is distributed more widely. Versus a small farmer's market outbreak, you might have the local health department investigate if a bunch of people are vomiting right after they eat. But beyond that, it's not going to make national news. So I would say buy local if you love it. But follow the same practices for food safety with local food that you would for other foods. And also you should feel comfortable going to the supermarket and getting your produce and meat there as well.
I want to thank everybody for joining us for this vital conversation on food safety. I'm really grateful you both would come back to the museum and speak to all of us, to provide insight, expertise. Your commitment to public health and consumer protection is something that is truly valuable. And I think just the conversation today really makes it clear that regulatory rollbacks do have real life consequences. And that's not just for policy, but for the safety of the food we eat. And for me, the trust that we might put in government institutions, public institutions. So as we move forward, the need for vigilance, advocacy, and I think Sarah said earlier, scientifically grounded policy.
I would like to say that if there's one message that your listeners should take away from this session, it is that there is still time to save our federal public health system. And one way to do that is to visit our website, cspinet.org, and hit the Get Involved tab and go to our Take Action page and send a message to your member of Congress to fight for our public health agencies.
Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you so much.
For more information, visit marlerclark.com or cspinet.org. We encourage everyone here to stay informed, stay engaged, and help amplify the voices calling for accountability and reform. On behalf of the American Museum of Tort Law, thank you again, and let's continue working together to defend the public's right to safe food and responsible regulation.